Louisiana, a land rich in history and resources, originally the home of the Natchez, the Homer, and the Choctaw, but the adopted home of Iberville, Bienville, and Tonti. Louisiana, the focus of international struggle and intrigue for centuries, a place of mystique, the home of a people known for distinct culture and institutions, the parish, the police jury. Louisiana, that catalyst would transform the former British North American colonists into a national melting pot. Louisiana, the birthplace of jazz, the refinement of blues and the gospel, the source of Creole and Cajun food, the home of Huey Long and Evangeline, Lee Armstrong and Marie Laveau. The Louisiana Purchase, arguably the world's most significant real estate transaction, will be the subject of this semester-long series, both on its immediate importance but its continuing impact today. Welcome. This week, number 7, marks the midpoint of our continuing series on the Louisiana Purchase. Our lecturer, history professor emeritus, Dr. Michael D. Clark, was a mainstay of the history department from 1964 on. He's eminently qualified, a Yale undergraduate, a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Clark was a scholar teacher, a recipient of a UNO Alumni Distinguished Undergraduate Teaching Award. He taught courses on the history of science and American intellectual history. His lecture takes a look at the pro-Louisiana Purchase arguments of 1803 and put them in the context of American expansionist ideology as it developed during the course of early national history. Clark emphasizes particularly the differences between the expansionism of the time of Jefferson and that of Manifest Destiny in the Mexican War of a half-century later.
The United States during the 19th century was probably as expansionist a nation as any in history. Americans began by purchasing the Louisiana Territory, advanced into the Oregon country, and conquered the Southwest in the 1840s, bought Alaska in 1867, and concluded the century by treating itself to a small overseas empire in the Spanish-American War of 1898. To rationalize this remarkable growth, they developed a fairly well-defined, though not always consistent ideology, by which I mean simply a body of ideas, doctrines, and myths serving the interest of a particular group or cause. What I want to do today is to put the contemporary attitudes toward the Louisiana Purchase in the context of this ideology as it evolved during the course of the century. I shall make use of 3 main points of reference. First, nature, the purchased territory perceived as a natural environment. Secondly, God, the hand of providence, which many Americans believed guided the affairs and shaped the destiny of the nation. And third, the favored role of Americans themselves as they saw it, their privileged position in time and space. What we shall see in the case of the Louisiana Purchase itself is what might seem to us even today a relatively innocent and benign ideology which associated American expansion closely with the cause of liberty, the interests of humanity, and the blessings of peace. The future of the country seemed threatened and uncertain in 1803, and defenders of the Purchase regarded it as clearly justified to preserve the right to navigate the Mississippi and preserve the union between the eastern and western states and territories. Further, Jeffersonian Republicans made much of the fact that the Jefferson administration accomplished the cession of Louisiana peacefully. They pointed out that French occupation would at best have required the United States to maintain a huge and expensive standing army. Actual war with the Napoleonic superpower might have cost 100,000 lives. The blood of your sons and brothers, a Connecticut Republican reminded his audience, might have turned red the Mississippi River. Under such circumstances, who, except for the carping opposition Federalists, could question this peaceful transaction, as President Jefferson put it, so replete with blessings to unborn millions of men? The benevolent note did not disappear from the later expansionist ideology, but the more aggressive expansionism in which the United States engaged after the later at the expense of Indians, Mexicans, and Spanish required bolder and to modern sensibilities morally more dubious arguments. Arguments which fashionable ideas of the 19th century were ready to supply. As peaceful diplomacy gave way to war, the universal interests of humanity yielded to a more strident nationalism, and most glaringly, racist doctrines assumed a dominant note. At the same time, these more extreme expressions of national ambition were not completely new, and it is possible to see their germs in the debate over Louisiana. Some were not satisfied with the new territory, as extensive as it was. To gain full advantage from Louisiana, it was argued in 1803, the United States must have as well not only the Floridas, but Cuba, and the South Carolina physician and historian David Ramsay already envisioned one happy union from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, from the lakes of Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. And while race played little direct part in the Louisiana debates, the discourse about the purchase reveals attitudes and assumptions which proved capable of mutating into a potent racism. In 1803, Louisiana meant, first of all, an immense natural environment. It was not, of course, entirely unknown to non-native peoples. French, Spanish, Anglo, African, and other colonists inhabited the lower portions of the territory, and travelers since the 17th century had passed through other areas and reported on what they had found. Like all travelers, they brought their preconceptions with them. Early descriptions of America tended to perceive it either as a wilderness — the term had none of the positive connotations that it does in our environmentally conscious age — but rather meant a threatening or merely barren desert, or as a land of milk and honey. Colonial promotion literature written to attract settlers to particular colonies naturally emphasized the theme of nature's plenty, seen in such titles as Leah and Rachel, the two fruitful sisters of Maryland and Virginia, 1656. New England Puritans seem to have been more impressed by the harshness of the devil's domain. Virginia writers like Robert Beverly and William Byrd II more inclined to revel in descriptions of turkeys, deer, and buffalo without number. But by far the dominant note, providing a mainstay of the arguments in favor of the purchase, was that of the overwhelming natural abundance of the territory. Even in the days of the American Revolution, the interior of the continent was being described as a new and enchanting region of inexpressible beauty and fertility. And advocates of the Louisiana Purchase developed the theme with enthusiasm, picking up on an image that would come to be much more widely applied. Allen Bowie Magruder, later briefly a U.S. Senator from Louisiana, called the lower district of the territory the Garden of America, filled with nature's rarest and most delightful productions. Magruder and others filled in the details, describing delightful groves of orange trees bending under the weight of their golden fruit, a profusion of shrimp and crawfish, and even, in pre-air-conditioned New Orleans, a most delightful and wholesome climate. Far to the north and west, the buffalo provided the perfect symbol of natural abundance before it became a symbol of wanton human destructiveness later in the century. One immense herd of bison, taking several days to pass the Missouri River, put a traveler in mind of the march of Xerxes' army. Again, it was left to anti-Louisiana Federalists to play the Grinches and scoff at the vast Garden of Eden offered by Jeffersonian Republicans. Hearing about a mountain of salt in a more remote part of the territory, one skeptic hoped soon for news of a lake of molasses and a veil of hasty pudding. Although clearly promotional, the theme of abundance seemed to include a genuine pride and interest in the natural riches of the territory, demonstrated in detailed reports of American flora and fauna, and extending even to prehistoric wonders. At the time of the purchase, Americans were still chafing from the contention of 18th century French naturalists that American animals were smaller and punier than their European counterparts. It was therefore gratifying to be able to report that the grizzly bear is sufficient to disprove the idle theories of Buffon and Raynal as to the impotency of the New World and the production of animals. But writers were most intrigued by the discovery in the West of bones of the woolly mammoth, a creature which once had been Thomas Jefferson's ace in the hole to silence Monsieur Buffon. Might the mammoth still exist somewhere, perhaps farther to the west? Jefferson had certainly hoped so. The growing realization that it had in fact vanished from the earth posed a problem for believers in natural abundance. As extinction destroyed a link of the great chain of being, which according to an ancient tradition represented both the plenitude of life and the unchanging stability of nature. Nevertheless, the great beast did service in defense of American honor, sounding as if the news of its demise had not reached Charleston. David Ramsay pointed out that the elephant of the East is far inferior in point of size to the mammoth of the West. This was not an idle observation. We cannot suppose, Ramsay inferred, that the extraordinary physical grandeur of America was created without design. And what design so probable as to be subservient to the same corresponding exalted state of man? This, of course, was the point. Advocates of the Louisiana Purchase were ultimately interested in the present and future human uses of the great territory, and specifically in its uses for white Americans. They assumed that God had created the earth for those who could best cultivate and improve it, and who were these but white Americans? They therefore hastened to point out the unlimited possibilities of Louisiana for growth and prosperity. Extrapolating from the early rapid growth of the U.S. population, Ramsay speculated that the bicentennial of the purchase might see the population of the nation as a whole at more than 1 billion people, many of them in the territory ceded by France. President Jefferson offered no such prediction, but he wrote to the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say in 1804 that America's immense extent of uncultivated and fertile lands made the United States an exception among nations. Contrary to the gloomy population theory of Thomas Malthus, Jefferson thought, Americans might be able to increase their food supply in pace with their increase of population, and thus escape the usual human deprivation. The inhabitants of Louisiana could produce such crops as sugar, rice, cotton, and indigo in great abundance, writers of the period were confident, and some had high hopes for such more exotic produce as silk, coffee, cocoa, and ginger. The possibilities of commerce engaged them even more fully. Already, of course, the premier outlet for Western trade, New Orleans in American hands seemed destined to become one of the principal cities of North America, the great mart, indeed, of all the Western world. With Louisiana in its possession, further, the United States would be uniquely situated to take advantage of the trade of Europe, South America, and Asia. Especially beguiling was the notion, pursued by visionaries and entrepreneurs over the next half-century, of a passage to India. Once the American reach extended to the sources of the Missouri River, it was speculated, somehow a trade route could be opened from there to the Pacific, thence to draw to America the wealth of the Indies. American ambition was least restrained during the era of the purchase in such dreams of commercial domination. The prospects held forth by the Louisiana cession simply confirmed the long-held conviction of Americans that theirs was a specially blessed land, a belief with roots in the Puritan sense of mission in their new Israel, and also in the Enlightenment age belief that America was nature's nation, uniquely enabled to escape the bonds of custom and tradition, to order itself according to natural law. Advocates of the purchase readily perceived in the cession of Louisiana the finger of a benevolent providence, a new phase of a grand plan which God had initiated with the discovery of America, give a more elevated destiny to the affairs of the world. It remained for Americans to accept and improve the gift of heaven, offered through the unlikely intermediation of Napoleon Bonaparte. Americans were equipped by Providence to do just that. They were the apparent beneficiaries of what would come later to be known as American exceptionalism, a happy exemption from ills which burden the rest of humanity. Although defenders of the Louisiana Purchase acknowledged that Americans' favored role owed something to the legacy of English institutions, the exceptionalism in their minds derived much more from space than from time, from geography more than history. And the fact that stood out above all others was simply the physical isolation of America from the rest of the world. Dreams of trade with the far corners of the globe seemed in no way to compromise the confidence that Louisiana would enable the nation once and for all to separate itself from the old world. Jefferson hoped that the United States might be as detached from the affairs of Europe as was China, and the Chinese model was invoked by some of his Republican followers. So was the president's warning in his message to Congress in October of 1803 that the country must not squander the singular blessings of the position in which nature has placed us, the opportunity she has endowed us with of pursuing the paths of industry, peace, and happiness apart from the calamitous scenes of Europe. By removing the prospect of French dominion in America, the Jefferson administration had sealed the charter of our salvation from the European system of wars, kings, and despotism. For such a Jeffersonian Republican as Allen Magruder, the wide oceans which separated America from this spectacle of human folly and misfortune served an explicitly moral and even religious purpose. Providence kept America isolated in order to preserve it in moral innocence. French recolonization of Louisiana would have introduced vice and corruption as well as militarism, driving the United States, like Adam, from the bowers of innocence by her own folly, had the nation permitted such an outcome. The alliance with Britain, to which a French occupation might have forced the country, would have been equally corrupting. Escaping these dangers, the United States might establish what Jefferson called an empire of liberty. Americans used the term empire surprisingly freely at the beginning of the 19th century to refer to their own country, and especially to the West. In this context, it meant not a colonial or imperial system in the political sense, but rather an immense extent of territory, a great combination of geographical regions. In its Jeffersonian association with liberty, it connoted not so much a political entity, as Julian P. Boyd pointed out, but a realm of the mind and spirit. Writers sometimes use the term federal empire, suggesting the means by which liberty was extended. The admission of new states to the Union, extending the principle of self-government indefinitely, effectively reconciled empire with liberty. Despite their enthusiasm for Louisiana's commercial prospects, the truest Republicans did not forget the Jeffersonian principle that the independent farmer made the best citizen. Closeness to the soil fostered the sentiments of natural liberty, as one put it, and they rejoiced that the empire of liberty would be populated mainly by those in agrarian pursuits. Despite the ambitious rhetoric, the Jeffersonian Empire of Liberty represented a vision which was not, in the main, narrowly nationalistic, nativistic, or xenophobic. Americans at the time of the Louisiana Purchase were still heavily committed to the universal principles of the Enlightenment and closely associated American interests with those of the world. The ocean separated us from the rest of humanity, they believed, precisely so that we might better serve humanity. One of the most prominent themes of the discussion of Louisiana, accordingly, was the idea that America was a place of refuge for the unfortunate of the earth, an asylum which the new territory would generously enlarge. The theme was not new, and of course it would have a lasting place in American life. In 1784, John Filson, reputed ghostwriter of Daniel Boone's autobiography, had praised the embryonic state of Kentucky, situated in the central part of the extensive American empire, for offering an asylum in the wilderness for the distressed of mankind. The refrain was picked up and more broadly applied by advocates of the Purchase. The Connecticut Republican Abraham Bishop perceived in the new territory an asylum for the oppressed of all nations. Allen Magruder proposed that posterity observe the anniversary of the signing of the Purchase Treaty in perpetuity, for it has expanded the asylum of human misery and opened an everlasting retreat to the fugitive liberties of mankind. David Ramsay similarly rejoiced that the territory enlarged the asylum for our oppressed brothers in the human race in all parts of the world, and quoted Jesus, "Come unto me, all you that are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Even Julien Poydras, addressing the Legislative Council of Orleans as its first president in 1804, alluded to the secure refuge to the oppressed of all nations on earth, which the American continent offered. Fleeing all their old world misery, refugees would of course come into a much happier life. In our more cynical times, the frequency with which Americans of 200 years ago used the terms happy and happiness to describe their hopes for their society is startling. They meant not so much a personal happiness sparing them from the ordinary troubles of life, it seems, but a social happiness which would provide them with the means to security and sufficiency. Jefferson's right to the pursuit of happiness was far from a novel or isolated expression. Further, Americans clearly looked beyond the right to the pursuit to the expectation that their youthful country would truly achieve this happiness. The West had a special, culturally conditioned role to play in this project. In mythology, as Lauren Barrett's pointed out, the West was associated with a yearning for a land of laughter, of peace, of life eternal. In a more spiritual vein, such eminent Puritans as Samuel Sewall and Jonathan Edwards had suggested that America's western location destined the country for a future bathed in divine glory. How far advocates of the Louisiana Purchase were influenced by such associations is uncertain, but conscious that they were already citizens of the freest and happiest nation on earth, they marveled at so great an extension of human happiness as this westward expansion would make possible. Magruder believed that America is a more happy planet, moving in an elevated orb, lighting and adorning and giving life and vigor to a higher sphere of human action. Why not then enlarge this sphere? For the Philadelphia novelist Charles Brockden Brown, indeed, Americans were entitled to Louisiana because the peace and happiness of these states assigned it to us. The committee of the House of Representatives made it official. The government of the United States is differently organized from any other in the world, and explained in its report on implementing the Louisiana Treaty. Its object is the happiness of mankind, its peace and interest to pursue right by right means. Amid such expressions of pride and joy, however, there were hints of trouble in paradise. Sympathy for ethnic diversity was not unlimited. Captain Amos Stoddard, who presided over the transfer of Upper Louisiana to the United States at St. Louis, expressed a high opinion of the French inhabitants of the territory, but he was less complimentary about the crude and heterogeneous assemblage of Spaniards, Creoles, Aboriginals, mixed breeds, and other apparently unsavory elements of the population. These groups, he granted, seemed to be the happiest people on earth, but he thought it a great mistake to suppose them capable of self-government. Prospects for the American Indians under U.S. rule drew forth the most contradictory observations. Allen Magruder expressed confidence that the purchase would allow the United States to civilize the Indians and minister to their happiness, yet in the next breath reflected upon the sad destiny which would force the native people to yield to the mysterious decrees of Providence and at last to be completely swept from the face of the earth. Equally ominous was Charles Brockden Brown's warning regarding American vulnerabilities should Louisiana be occupied by France, that the blacks are a bane in our vitals, most deadly that ever a nation was infested with. What if America's happiness should not be, after all, the happiness of all humankind? As Americans advanced across the continent in the decades following the Louisiana Purchase, expansionist ideology adapted both to the country's changing political and social situation and to a changing intellectual climate. Perhaps most nearly constant was the theme of abundance, although emphasis shifted somewhat from the bounty of nature to that which human labor and enterprise could produce. The description of Louisiana as a garden was magnified into the image of the Mississippi Valley as the garden of the world, a master symbol of 19th century America, Henry Nash Smith contended, which defined the promise of American life. The commercial expansion promoted so enthusiastically in 1803 remained very much a part of the ideology, although Lewis and Clark failed to find the passage to India, a practicable commercial route linking the far reaches of the Missouri River with the Pacific. Natural abundance combined with the technology of the railroad, farm machinery, and other innovations to make the Americans a people of plenty in the eyes of the world, as David Potter pointed out. Americans continued to believe in the blessings of providence upon their land, but the religious sanctions for expansion were developed more formally and aggressively in the context of 19th century Romanticism and German idealist philosophy. The historian George Bancroft, who absorbed a double dose of romantic and idealist thought in his native New England and as a graduate student in Germany, presented American democracy as the ultimate stage of human progress, promising the regeneration of the world and mandating Americans by a kind of collective predestination to govern states and territories of imperial extent as one federal republic. Not only a leading scholar, Bancroft was also Secretary of the Navy under President James K. Polk shortly before the Mexican War of 1846 to 48. American expansionism was at its height during this period. It shows the ways in which ideology had mutated in the scant 2 generations since the Louisiana Purchase. It was the time when popular expansionism came to be identified with the ringing term of manifest destiny, coined by the journalist John O'Sullivan in 1845 to denote the mission of the United States to expand throughout the entire North American continent. More broadly, it has also served as an umbrella term to signify the belief that the United States has a special responsibility to bring the world the regenerating and progressive influence of American institutions and values. This unquestioning confidence in what the United States stood for provided much of the continuity in expansionist ideology, but it has been expressed in sharply different ways over the course of time. One very old idea which received new attention in the 19th century was the notion that the seat of empire moves inexorably from east to west. In the 1720s, the British bishop and philosopher George Berkeley had delivered a one-liner that soon became a cliche: "Westward the course of empire takes its way." But the idea was already an ancient one. Jonathan Carver, who traveled extensively in the interior of North America during the 1760s, already saw the implication for America. As the seat of empire from time immemorial has been gradually progressive toward the west, there is no doubt that in some future period, mighty kingdoms will emerge from these wildernesses, he thought. The argument received little emphasis at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, but Allen Magruder, covering all bases as usual, attributed to Voltaire the observation that the ball of empire was rolling towards the west. Contrary to Carver's prediction, however, it would not be kingdoms which would arise in consequence. Magruder rejoiced that with Louisiana in American hands, the rolling ball of empire would now carry Republican sentiments with it. The bare idea of the Western progression of empires, an occasional reference in 1803, came to be much elaborated over the next half-century, gaining what seemed to be scientific support and functioning as a sophisticated intellectual foundation for the popular cry of manifest destiny. German scholars played a particularly prominent role. Based on the belief that Sanskrit was the original source of the Indo-European languages and identifying language with race, they theorized that India was the womb of the world, out of which had come the specially gifted Indo-European or Indo-Germanic people, later known as Aryans. These natural leaders had over centuries followed the sun westward, coming in time to dominate Europe and the world. Such views gained a significant following in the United States. Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, a prominent Jacksonian Democrat, an ardent expansionist, cited the ancient urge of the children of Adam to follow the sun, and pointed out that the American advance to the Pacific, which would enable the country to capture the trade of Asia, would complete the circuit of the globe from which India had been the starting point thousands of years before. William Gilpin, promoting a transcontinental railroad, bought into the same idea, appropriating geographical theory as well as history to argue that ancient empires, Greece, Rome, Spain, and Britain, had in fact succeeded each other in an imperial march westward within a belt of temperate climate. Thomas Hart Benton, at least, was old-fashioned enough to identify the American advance westward with the interests of humanity as a whole, just as advocates of American possession of Louisiana had argued that it would benefit all peoples. To assume that what was good for the United States was good for the world was, of course, highly presumptuous and potentially careless of other people's interests in its own way. But it reflected the lingering strength of the universalism of the 18th century Enlightenment, a belief reflected in such documents as the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, that the human race was one and shared the same basic qualities and natural rights. The most fundamental shift which took place in the ideology of expansion in the half-century following the cession of Louisiana was a pervasive movement away from this universalism toward a particularism which emphasized the differences among peoples, nations, and races. Very broadly, this particularism was supported by romantic artists and thinkers fascinated with what did not fit into the uniform categories valued by the Enlightenment. Nationalists, eager to celebrate the distinctiveness and specialness of their own countries, and racists, who found in the increasingly important biological sciences and pseudosciences a new way to divide humankind. Some theorists even argued that different races were in fact different species. Dr. Josiah C. Nott of Mobile, Alabama is a leading American example of this polygenism. Difference did not necessarily mean inequality, but in practice it came readily to support the ranking of races in terms of innate inferiority and superiority. The impact of these new currents of thought on the ideology of expansion is seen most clearly in the case of the people known as Anglo-Saxons. English colonists had brought to America a strong collective memory, in which history was mixed with myth, of these Germanic tribes which had occupied England in the 5th century. Their association with traditional English liberties gave them enormous symbolic and emotional value. Defenders of Parliament invoked them in 17th century struggles with the Stuart kings, opposing oppressions supposed to have been introduced by William the Conqueror and his Normans. For good measure, some Protestants ascribed to the Anglo-Saxon Church a purer Christianity which had anticipated the Reformation. Americans found the ancient Anglo-Saxon Constitution equally useful in their dispute with the British government in the events leading up to the Revolution. No one used the Anglo-Saxon precedents more earnestly than Thomas Jefferson, who diligently studied the Anglo-Saxon language and proposed that the Great Seal of the United States depict the figures of Hengist and Horsa, whom he described as the Saxon chiefs from whom we have the honor of being descended, and from whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. His vision for America was indeed based on a restoration of Anglo-Saxon law, and he devoted much energy to the purging of such relics of Norman feudalism as Virginia's law of primogeniture. Has not every restitution of the ancient Saxon laws had happy effects? He queried a correspondent in 1776. Jefferson admired the Anglo-Saxons for their political and social institutions, however, not for their race. They were worthy of emulation because they represented a free and uncorrupted society of self-sufficient farmers who had possessed their land in allodial tenure, held outright and without feudal obligations, not because of their genetic makeup. Indeed, prior to about 1815, the term Anglo-Saxon was simply not much used in a racial sense, and perhaps partly for that reason appeared little in the debates over Louisiana. All of this changed later in the century. The Anglo-Saxons continued to be identified with that love of liberty which was the child of the German forests, as George Bancroft put it. The first Virginians, he noted, were Anglo-Saxons in the woods again. But others who were far more influenced by the new racial doctrines than Bancroft made love of liberty a matter of race. Anglo-Saxonism had become pervasive in expansionist rhetoric by mid-century. According to the racial hierarchy in favor in England and the United States, the Caucasians were superior to all other races. The Germanic peoples, the most capable of the Caucasians, and the Anglo-Saxons, the racial elite of the Germanic branch. But in common usage, Anglo-Saxon was apt to refer indiscriminately to just about any English-speaking white Protestant. The predictable result was the denigration of other races as inferior, as lacking almost in a common humanity. and therefore as fit candidates for conquest, subordination, or elimination. This attitude was certainly the most catastrophic change in expansionist ideology from the time of the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, needless to say, American Indians and African Americans were not accorded fair or equal treatment in word or deed. References to blacks assumed, in some sense, their inferiority as slaves, and references to Indians sometimes contemplated their eventual extinction. The seeds of later, more virulent views were present. Yet race had not entirely overwhelmed the sense of common humanity. The acquisition of Louisiana was rationalized as an opportunity to bring to the Indians the benefits of civilization, and in any event, it was still possible to think that the Native Americans would remain in undisturbed possession of their western lands for at least a century. As for slavery, it had not yet been elevated in 1803 to the status of a positive good. A visitor to Lower Louisiana shortly after the purchase reflected that the earth which brought forth the abundance of nature had been moistened by the tears of hundreds who labored to support a haughty lordling's pride, an image of poison, disease, and death in the midst of an earthly paradise. Allen Magruder's confident expansionism faltered only when he considered the place of slavery in the new territory. To be really happy, he observed, a nation must be truly just, and he warned that the deadly vengeance of the injured African would receive the sanction of the God of justice. But he was encouraged to think that the Louisiana Territory offered the possibility of colonizing the slaves in its vast reaches, thus delivering the country from its greatest misfortune. All such hopes and rationalizations, of course, were mocked by the later realities of Indian removal and extirpation, and of the southwesterly expansion conducted in the interests of the extension of slavery. The Mexicans, at whose expense that expansion was largely carried out, had been a non-issue in 1803. A rare comment on the subject expressed an offhand confidence that vast open plains would long prevent any boundary problems with Mexico. Yet here, too, a change in expansionist ideology can be seen. American observers sometimes spoke disparagingly of the non-Anglo inhabitants of Louisiana in the early part of the century, and usually assumed that what they needed was a good dose of American republicanism and enterprise. But aside from Federalist opponents of the cession, who professed to worry about the diversity of laws, language, and custom that it would introduce into the United States, there was considerable optimism that the peoples involved could join successfully. Like converging streams, one visitor to Louisiana noted in 1811, the French and Americans were beginning to mingle. The Americans had communicated to the French, he thought, their industry and spirit of enterprise, but the French had contributed some of their more gentle and amiable customs to the mix. Openness to mingling and the convergence of population streams had faded considerably by the time of the Mexican War, replaced by a widespread revulsion from the prospect of amalgamation with inferior peoples. Adoption of much of the white man's civilization did not save the Georgia Cherokees from dispossession and removal, and the unwillingness of many to take into the Union so many people of a different race contributed to President Polk's decision not to annex all of Mexico in 1848. Those who did argue for complete annexation contemplated the subordination of Mexicans to Anglo-Saxon rule, or their eventual replacement by Anglo-Saxons, rather than equal citizenship. Altogether, expansionism of an outright racist character reached a high point during the period of the Texas Revolution and Mexican War. Sam Houston represented many Texans and Americans in his view of the struggle as one between a glorious Anglo-Saxon race and an inferior Mexican rabble. Such views did not completely take over American attitudes toward other countries and peoples, of course. There were still old fogies like George Bancroft, who, for all his faith in Germanic world leadership, believed that freedom is of all races and nationalities. Belief in a benevolent American mission to the world remained strong. In the late 19th century, the lamp newly raised in New York Harbor to offer asylum for the needy and oppressed represented the United States as truly as did those who at the same time were proclaiming Anglo-Saxon engagement in a world struggle for the survival of the fittest. As usual, history is a tangled web. Any effort to untangle American attitudes toward expansionism and other peoples must take us back to 1803. And I think most of all to the man who presided over the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson had a way of standing at the crossroads of American hopes and values, and his personal contradictions often reflected those of his country. He was a man of the world who hoped that the Louisiana Purchase would enable the United States to stand apart from the rest of the globe. A champion of the self-sufficient farmer, soon forced to admit the necessity of manufacturing, would drive Americans from the agrarian Garden of Eden that he had expected Louisiana to provide for centuries to come. He denied the constitutionality of annexing new territory, but became, along with James K. Polk, the country's greatest expansionist. Most significant of all is the contradiction between Jefferson, the Enlightenment Universalist, who wrote that all men are created equal, and Jefferson, the slave owner, whose doubts about the equal ability of the races moved one contemporary defender of the Purchase to take him to task for his disgraceful prejudices. In Jefferson's consuming interest in the natural world, which he charged Lewis and Clark to report upon on their journey across the Louisiana Territory to the Pacific, there was no contradiction that would have made sense to the people of his time. Yet there were in this too different and divergent possibilities. Exploitation of natural abundance made possible the achievement of a nation of plenty and its eventual consumer society. Only later and belatedly came the realization of a need for conservation and preservation of that which had seemed inexhaustible in 1803. In so many ways, the expansionism of 2 centuries ago contained the seeds of the American future.
To learn more about the Louisiana Purchase and the rich history of Louisiana, visit the Louisiana State Museum's Cabildo, located on historic Jackson Square in the heart of the New Orleans French Quarter.